To Talks from my bedroom floor. This is gonna be soon. It will be a new bedroom, but that's not important because today we're talking about First Samuel once again. We're talking about Saul's anointment. So let me face it to the light because I'm using natural lighting. So I can actually see. All right, so kind of some major things. So basically, this is when we're finally kind of moving along. So God has said, "Hey, I'm gonna give you a king. You're gonna get what you're asking for to the Israelite people." And so, in order for this to happen, God sets up this kind of like, I don't know. It was so interesting, kind of seeing all these little pieces of how. Let me actually grab my Bible this time because I think it's just easier. Like I take notes, but also my notes, I don't always write down like the exact details, and sometimes I really want to look at the exact details. So the first things we see is we have some donkeys escape. Okay, so Saul's father's donkeys disappear, and so of course he's like, okay, go find them, bro. And Saul's like, okay, I'll take me and my servant. We'll go, and so they go, and then all of a sudden, they're like, oh, well, what are we gonna do? And so soon enough, they're like, oh, well, in order to find these donkeys, who should we talk to? And they're like, well, maybe you should go see a seer, aka a prophet. Perfectly timed, right? The servant comes up with that. Not Saul, the servant comes up with that. Um, because Saul wants to go back home. He's like, maybe, what does he say? Come on, let's go back. My father stopped worrying about the donkeys and start worrying about us. And so the servant is the one who's like, hey, what do we do? And then he's like, I still don't. What are we gonna do? We don't have money or food or gifts. And then the servant has it. So God is setting up this whole thing with the servant. The servant is gonna be the donkey, right? And so donkey connects to the king, right? To Jesus. And so there were all these little things. Talking about the servant is the one, and then they're gonna go see a prophet. Anyways, and so then they go, and then all of a sudden they're like, as they're making their way, they see women, and they're like, hey, do you know what the seer is? And they're like, oh yeah, he's in town and he's conveniently here for a for an event. And so, not an event, but it is an event. He's there to sacrifice for the people today. And so it's like, this is perfect timing, right? God's perfect timing. So that's kind of crazy. And then, yeah, and then God tells Samuel that this is going to happen. And so Samuel's already aware. And so it's crazy because all these little events had to happen, and they happened perfectly because God planned it. And then all of a sudden, boom, right? It's like things don't happen by coincidence. And so then something that I noticed, and this too, is that the first thing that Samuel does, Samuel doesn't, Samuel, even though he's not like getting a ton, like there's no reason, I mean, there is a reason, but like from an outside perspective, it's like this, Samuel has no reason to like serve or do anything for this random dude who is looking for his donkey, right? On from an outside perspective, but Samuel has already been told by God exactly what things are gonna play out and what he needs to say, and so things are moving. But Saul doesn't know. He's like, I don't know what's going on, and so then Samuel does this whole thing. So Samuel took Saul and his servant, brought them to the banquet hall, and gave them a place at the head of the 30 or so men who'd been invited. So get the portion of meat that I give you and told you to set aside. And so instantly we have this image of, and you also remember, like, this is a big deal. Like, Saul is this random dude from this far off place. And all of a sudden he's like the important guest at the table. And he's in front of all these other important men, these men at this table. And then he's given like the thigh, which is like, super super yummy, right? And so it's all this thing of like being like, we're going to serve you even though you don't. It's kind of this proof of like I don't know, kingship and like servanthood. And also, I mean, everything points back to Jesus, right? And so we look at Jesus talking about being a servant. And so what does Samuel do? He goes, I'm going to treat you the way that a king should be treated. And then we look at when is it Mary um who washes Jesus's feet, and we see this servanthood, um and we see what he does. And so I don't know, I thought that was just kind of like it's a cool like image of a kingship. It also, I think, kind of, it's an interesting because it's also kind of like a weird, like an inverse mirror. I don't know, does that make sense? It's like inverse of Jesus. So it's like when Saul is coming, they treat him greatly, and they treat him all like high, and there's other parts of this. But then when Jesus comes, it's kind of in a completely opposite way. So Saul is a man and he's getting treated like this, but Jesus is king as well, and he gets treated, has a whole it's kind of these interesting, it's an interesting, and the whole thing about the donkey is kind of cool. I don't know, there were just all these like little connection pieces. And then, okay, so yeah, talk about the donkeys, we're on to chapter 10. Yeah, the part about the three goats. So talk about sacrifice, the two loaves of bread, and the jar of wine, right? And so again, images of offering. Jesus is the offering. The two loaves of bread we see multiple times in the New Testament, talking about when Jesus is doing miracles and breaking bread, the Last Supper, and the wine. We see the miracles at the wedding, and then also at the Last Supper. And we kind of this cool connection of like kingship and talking about all three of those pieces, right? And then the offering and the sacrifice being Jesus. Instead of us sacrificing to him, he sacrifices himself. He is those offerings. He is, during the Last Supper, he says, "This is my blood. This is my flesh, and this is." And so it's the opposite. Does that make sense? Does that make more sense of like how I'm seeing it? Of like it's kind of the inverse. And then another part of it. And then the Spirit of God comes. So the Spirit of God comes upon Saul, and he starts prophesying. And so people are like, oh, what did they say? What has happened to the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets? And so this is an interesting piece. Because to me, part of it is like, well, they're not expecting it. Like, they aren't expecting this king to start prophesying. Only God could possibly be the reason why these acts of God are why prophesying is happening. And then we see kind of another inverse in the New Testament where we have the Jewish people, or specifically the leaders, not the Jewish people in general, but the leaders, the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin and Sadducees, and they go, we're seeing all these things, we're seeing the proof in Scripture, we see it over and over and over again. I think it's Matthew primarily who does that, where he notes like all these different proofs. I think John, they all do it, they all notice it, but they note these parts. Well, I don't remember if Mark does. I don't know. Anyways, I know at least Matthew does, and I think, and then John also does. Luke might, maybe, I don't know. Where they mark all the places where there's like where Scripture was fulfilled, right? And so it's interesting that in this moment he's like, oh, only God could prophesy, and they're noticing that like something has happened to this man. He must not be from. He like something has changed about him, and then versus like the Pharisees when they were like, this can't possibly be, and so they were trying to deny it, and while the regular people I mean, obviously we're noticing it the same way of like something different. There's something different about these Christians, about this Jesus, about these followers of Jesus. There's something different. Um, yeah, I don't know. That's kind of cool. It's also interesting talking about Samuel tells Saul of his kingship and stuff once the servant is gone. So we make sure that it's and is alone. So we learn, kind of this idea of like we learn God's plans when we're by ourselves, when we're praying, when we have these moments of a lot of times loneliness and kind of this feeling of isolation. Like a lot of times, I mean, we have it when we're with people, right? So talking about Samuel, like Samuel and Saul are together, so they're in these moments, this community, but also he's alone. But there's also a certain loneliness too, right? You're with this man, but you're also separate. The things that God has in store for you are also going to be separate from the rest of the world. We're going to find out these things. I don't know. Does that make sense? I have like 4 ideas in my head all at the same time. I don't know if they all made sense together, but anyways, also what happens before before the sun comes up, which is just a really poetic God be a poet. God is a poet. What can we say? And talking about like, oh, it's a new day, it's a new era, it's a new life for you. And then this talking about the spirit comes over him and stuff and all sorts of stuff. And then also, oh, another part, he's a Benjaminite, and he talks about it. He's like, I'm just a Benjaminite. I'm from the smallest tribe in Israel, and so once again, choosing a king who you don't expect, right? Choosing this not a man of crazy. I mean, he's tall, and so that's a whole other point that kind of. I'm getting there. I'm seeing all these different things. I don't know if it's all making sense, but I'm going with it. Sometimes God be showing all sorts of stuff. There's all sorts of connections and all sorts of things that God does all at the same time. Sometimes it's overwhelming. Anyways, yeah, he's like, okay. Oh yeah, okay. So, yeah, he chooses seemingly, once again, God chooses someone who seemingly at first, description you're like, we don't expect this guy. But also, he is a head taller. So that goes kind of the opposite of the first part, right? So the first part is like he chose a guy from a small random place, but he chose someone who is a head taller. Like he's noticeable. It is somebody who stands out, even though his status doesn't stand out, he stands out. Does that make sense? Of like, even though sometimes God chooses people that at first, if we were just to, describe them or just, we would just cast them aside, but there's a reason and there's something that stands out. There's something different, and that's kind of cool about Saul. I guess that he's tall, but his appearance, and then it kind of goes into the idea of like, then you also can start thinking about like, oh well, Jesus came and he looked like everybody else. It wasn't like he looked completely different. He didn't look like a king. Not necessarily that Saul did look like a king, but he was taller. He was bigger than everybody else, and so it makes sense that the king's going to be taller, and Jesus came as a baby, right? So the king comes in this small version versus as this tall guy, right? This first king of Israel, and then the true king of all comes as a baby. And so I don't know, it's kind of an interesting dichotomy, but also similarity. Like there's a lot. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but you can see these kind of connections. I hope that you can kind of see these connections that I'm making. But then he goes back home. That's another piece of like, even though he's anointed as king, it's like, oh, you're not, like, you still are going to go back home. Like sometimes you're still going to have to go back home. Even though you have a calling, it doesn't mean that you're done, getting ready, because other things have to happen. And so the Ammonites come, and then here we go. The Spirit of God suddenly became powerfully on him, and his anger burned furiously. Furiously? Yeah, furiously. And so, talking about righteous anger, this connects back to James that I was reading a couple days ago, when it talks about like God, like human anger does not prove righteousness, but God's anger does. That does, because it's from God. And so this righteous anger. And so it's kind of weird because he chops up these oxen and then he sends them out. And because, here we go, as a result, the terror of the Lord fell on the people and they went out united. So this, I mean, what God inspired, the fear of the Lord came over and it terrified the people to become one. They united over this. So God brought all these people who, even though they were like, oh, this is weird, like we're getting sent scary. It actually says, yes, sent them throughout the territory of Israel by messengers that this is what will be done to the ox of anyone who doesn't march by Saul and Samuel. So it is kind of scary, being like, you're either for us or you're against us. What's your choice? And the people decide, out of the fear of God, they go, okay, we'll do what you say. Right? And that has to happen, right? Our fear of the Lord has to be greater than our fear of the world. And that's exactly what's going on here. And then they win. Yeah. And then they win. Because of the fear of the Lord. Because God used Saul for this. So I think that's just all really cool. My brain was going, it was going 30 miles a minute. I don't know. Sometimes God shows me, like, tells us things that we're like, I don't know. All sorts of stuff, and it's weird because sometimes it feels jumbled. I'm like, there's all these connections between things, and there's all these different stuff that feels, it's kind of big, but it's also exciting. It's kind of cool, right? It's like anytime God can tell you something about himself, about what he's doing, what his plan is, using all sorts of people, I forgot about this story. I honestly, I don't know, in the last I thought I read First Samuel more recently, but maybe I read Second Samuel. I don't know, but I don't know. I kind of forgot about this story about like Saul becoming king, and I think that's cool. Like God places those people and the important people, where they need to be. And he inspires people, and his spirit, the Holy Spirit coming on to people. He's been doing it. It wasn't just a New Testament thing, right? And talking about kingship, and that, like, yet another example of God always using something unexpected, an unexpected person, and only through his plan, only through this kind of, and the use of these connections of things that can happen in the Old Testament, the New Testament, that like seemingly, you're like, wait, those are kind of similar. Like there's always God puts little things together that, like, I don't know, it's just really cool when you see those like little connections, and whether or not they're like big connections, right? They don't have to be big things. They could be little things like that, where it's like, oh, that reminds me of like something I read recently, or something else that God was saying in another, in another verse, or a whole other book of the Bible. It's like those, or in another part of my life. I don't know. And especially recently, I've also been, praying a lot for direction, and I think it's really cool to be like, God uses unexpected things, and this idea of timing and perfection, and sometimes like just being like, I don't know how or what is gonna happen, but God's got a bigger plan than I can see. The blueprint is for all our little lives. Every little human on this earth it's much more is connected. It's much more complex than we can possibly imagine, and that's something really cool. Like God uses all of us. He used those women. He put them specifically in town to know those places, to direct those men. He put the servant there specifically Obviously for there's other reasons, but you get what I'm saying. You get what I'm saying. Um, I don't know. It's just super neat because there's just so much. I don't know. When you look for God, He's there. um, if you give Him a chance, and that's pretty neat.